Hi everyone, I'm Allie. Join me in creating this Flat Stitch Sample Bracelet. The Stitch Sample Bracelet is going to give you a nice overview of ladder stitch, right angle weave, herringbone stitch, peyote stitch, and then going into brick stitch, and then sewing them all together. So make sure you stay tuned the whole way through the video to see all of these techniques and their completion of sewing them together. Remember, if you need any supplies, go ahead and look below the video in the description to shop with us online. Gather up some 8OC beads and let's get started. So we're going to be creating this flat stitch sample bracelet. We're going to be learning 5 different stitches as we go in and create this nice, larger, thicker bracelet. They're going to be 4 independent strands that are held together by 2 pieces of brick stitched ends. You're going to be learning ladder stitch, herringbone, peyote, right angle weave, and then brick stitching at the end before we end our clasp. This bracelet is about 7 or 8 years old, and I'm finally getting around to doing this sample video for you. We're going to be using 4 different colors of 8OC beads and then 1 supporting 11O. The reason I'm using multiple colors is to keep track of the different steps of the stitches so that way you can gauge what beads go where. I'm using my 4 8OC beads in the Miyuki brand. Any colors will work. And then I have 1 11OC bead that we'll use for our clasp as well as in the brick stitch and in our herringbone section. It's always a great idea to start out with 8Os, which are going to be a little bit bigger seed bead, so that way you can progress faster. We're going to begin with ladder stitch, what I would consider the easiest of all of the stitches. If you need more help and you're watching the video and you're a little confused, I have individual videos on each stitch as well. We're going to begin the ladder stitch with all 4 colors of our 8OC beads. I'm starting out with this watermelon color, and I have 2 beads on a size 10 needle and about 4 feet of beading thread. From here, I'm going to add 2 more beads in my next color, which is that Picasso, and I'm going to sew up through those 2 beads that I added first. My thread's currently coming out the top of the beads. I'm going into the bottom after adding 2 more beads. From here, I want to progress further to add more beads, so I'm going to go back through the 2 that I just added. After I'm through those 2 that I just added, I'll pick up my next color, which is going to be my bayberry there. And again, thread's coming out the bottom this time, adding the beads, sewing into the top of the beads that the thread was coming out of. Needing to progress, I know I need to sew through the beads that I just added. You're going to want to do this ladder stitch section for about 5 inches if you want to get a 7 1/4 inch bracelet. If you know you have a little bit larger wrist, go ahead and make it 5 1/2 or 6 inches. Again, thread's coming out the top of those last 2 beads. I add 2 beads onto my needle and sew into the bottom. Once my thread is out those 2 previous beads, I go and sew through the 2 I just added. I'm using the black wildfire thread for this in size 6 because that is easily viewable by you who is learning. If you want to, you could use a nice green color as well. So you can see how that ladder stitch looks like rungs of a ladder, how it got its name. Continue on for about 5 inches and then we'll get ready for our next stitch, which is going to be our herringbone stitch. Now that we've finished our flat ladder stitch, I'm going to put this to the side, again, keeping the needle and thread and everything on it. And I've threaded a new needle, and I'm going to begin on my herringbone stitch. For the herringbone stitch, I am starting with 2 beads. I have my seafoam and I have my bayberry. I also have out my 11OC beads, which are going to work to cover up some thread on the project. We're doing herringbone stitch here, and we're going to have it face it the right way here so that the beads are sitting inside one another almost in a series of V. To begin, I want you to put on 1 turquoise, 1 blue, another blue, and another of that turquoise seafoam. Let that drop down, just hold on to the end of your thread, and you're going to sew up through the first 2 beads. So your needle and thread is going to come out between the 2 blue beads. And you can see that just sets them right one on top of the other. From here, we're going to begin our herringbone stitch. In herringbone, 2 beads get added. You're coming up in the center of the last 2 beads. Add 2 beads and sew down through bead number 2 of the row your thread is currently coming out of. That puts 2 more beads right there in that herringbone style. From here, add 1 11-0, which is going to be used to decorate the side. And we're stepping up by going through bead number 1 toward bead number 2 of the row we just finished. So we just finished row 3. Coming out of bead number 1 from row 3, I'm going to add 2 more beads, switching to my blue color now. And then I'm going to go down bead number 2. So you're always coming up out of bead number 1 and you're going down bead number 2. Once you're down bead number 2, add 1 11-0 seed bead and sew back up through bead number 1 that you just added. Now I like to flip this in my hands as I'm working with it. I find that easier to hold, always just sew away from me. So you'll notice I'm coming up bead number 1, I add 2 beads. I'm going to sew down bead number 2, and as I do so, I flip that in my hand. So that way my thread's always coming out on the right hand side. Add 11-0 and step up through the last bead you just added. Again, switching colors, 2 beads get added. So down bead number 2, flip it in your hand as you're working on it. It's kind of therapeutic to do. That forces those beads to sit right inside of one another. Add 1 silver 11-0 and sew back up through the second of those 2 beads that you just added. Then I'm going to say I'm coming out of bead number 1, add 2 more beads. And remember, you can always slow this down. I'm sewing down bead number 2 and at the same time flipping it in my hand, adding 1 11-0 seed bead just to cover up the thread on the side, and then pulling. Just like the ladder stitch in most stitches, after you add beads, you'll want to pull close to the design to make sure that you're getting that nice fishbone pattern. From here, you want to continue your stitch so that it matches in length to the previous piece of ladder stitch as well. So I have them both to that 5 inches or so, making sure that they end. And once again, keep that needle on that thread, because if you need to even them out and have one more row on, you can do that easily if the thread's already there. So I'm going to stick these 2 aside and we're going to progress to our next piece here. Our next piece is going to be our peyote stitch. And for the peyote stitch piece, we are going to be doing 4 rows total of peyote stitch. And again, another piece of needle and thread and 2 colors of your beads. So next up is our peyote stitch. I have a new piece of thread and I've put at the end of my thread one of my 11-0 seed beads to work as a stop bead. So I've taken the needle and thread through there 2 times and this eventually will come off the design. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create the peyote in a pattern so that way it's easy for you to tell what you're doing. I'm going to pick up 4 of my green beads of that seafoam color and I'm going to let them drop down to that stop bead. Remember, you can go back if you're still working on the other designs, fine to do so. After adding those 4 beads, I'm going to pick up 1 of my watermelon. I'm going to skip over bead number 4 because we're going backwards, and I'm going to sew through bead number 3. So my needle and thread is going back towards that stop bead. What's going to happen then is my new bead, that nice watermelon color, is going to sit directly on top of bead number 4. And I've sewn through bead number 3. I'm going to put on 1 more of my watermelon bead, and then I'm going to sew through bead number 1, coming out before the stop bead, making sure I'm not sewing through that. And that puts in there bead number 2. So my original line of peyote, everything they had 4 beads that I was adding on. Each line after this, I'll add 2 beads at a time. We're doing even count peyote, and I'm going to do this in a lined pattern. So from here, I'm going to switch to my turquoise color. I'm adding 1 bead, and I'm going to reverse the thread and sew through that bead number 2 in the watermelon color that I just added. Coming out of that watermelon color bead, I'm going to add 1 of my turquoise beads again and sew through the next watermelon bead. At the end of each row, just like ladder stitch or herringbone stitch, give a tight little pull on your thread to tighten that up. Now I'm coming out of that last bead in what is actually the 3rd row when you do number 1 and 2, or the first 4 beads, those are 2 rows together. Row 1, row 2. I did row 3, which is my watermelon color, and then row 4, which was just my turquoise color again. From here, I'm going to add another bead. I'm going to add another one of my 8/0s, reverse the thread, sew through the beads. They always say with peyote that are sticking up, the beads that you just added to the stitch. Grab another one of your watermelon and sew through bead number 2 from that previous row. The thread now reverses and is going to come towards me, picking up the turquoise, because you'll notice I'm starting lines. And I'm going to add the turquoise bead and turn the thread back through bead number 1 of my design. Add a second bead in this row and go through the second of those watermelon beads. Turning the thread around, that turquoise bead is sticking up. Add the watermelon color, so back through the turquoise that you just added. Add a watermelon, so back through the second turquoise. So you can see how you're adding them almost in a brick wall section where they're sitting kind of side by side. When you're coming out of a bead, you add that same color onto your needle and sew through the alternate color from the row before. Add a turquoise, sew through the alternate color from the row before. Now I'm coming out the end here and I switch. Add, sew. Again, if you're having trouble with this, we have lots of videos on simple flat peyote stitch. So I'm going to continue now, getting in 5 inches of this peyote stitch to match the distance of my ladder stitch as well as my herringbone stitch. We're going to conquer this before we move on to right angle weave. So we have strands 1, 2, and 3, and now we're going to work on right angle weave. So we're going to work on that 4th strand, and we're going to be using 2 colors so we can keep track of the design and how you need it to work. So continue on with that flat stitch. We're going with right angle weave, which is going to start out with a series of 4 beads that are going to the end of a new piece of thread with a stop bead on it. I let that drop down towards the stop bead. And then I'm going to sew back through my blue, silver, blue beads. So back through the first 3 beads, starting at the stop bead and exiting before bead number 4. My blue beads are going to sit as I continue the strand so that the holes are facing up and down. The silver beads are going to fit so the holes are facing side to side. Continuing on now, I'm going to add a silver, a blue, and a silver. I'm going to use the right side bead of that first raw unit or that first right angle unit to become the left side of my next unit. I added 1 silver for the bottom, 1 new blue for the right, and 1 silver for the top. Coming out of the bottom of that blue bead, I'm going to sew into the top of that blue bead after adding those 3 beads onto my needle. From here, I'm going to sew back over so that my thread is coming out my rightmost bead, that right blue bead. So you'll notice last time my thread was coming out the bottom of the blue bead. This time it's coming out the top of the blue bead. It's going to alternate every single stitch. So from here now, I'm going to add my silver, blue, silver. The first silver is going to be the top, then the right with the blue, and then the bottom with the silver. Going in now to the bottom of that blue, because I'm coming out always, wherever the thread is coming out, that's where I'm sewing into the opposite side. And then I'm going to go through that silver that I just added. And then, once again, making sure that my thread is exiting through that right-hand blue bead. That is my 3 units. From here, I'm going to continue with that same pattern over and over, silver, blue, silver, sewing into the top since my thread is currently coming out of the bottom of that bead, sewing over the bottom bead or the top, depending on where your thread's coming out, and then making sure that you're exiting through your blue bead on the right-hand side. I'm going to continue with this same pattern, adding in these beads. Again, here I'm at the top, so I'm always sewing over, so my thread's always coming out of that right-hand bead. Once again, with right angle weave, it can be a little tricky, but your silver beads, you're going to want to look at them. They should all be facing so that the hole is coming right along the top and running basically from right to left. The same with the silver on the bottom. And then the blue beads, the holes are going to always go on that vertical up and down. Continue to build this again for another 5 inches. If you need help with the right angle weave, and this one is just a little bit too quick for you, make sure to check out some of our other right angle weave videos, which we will link in the description of this video below. Also, if you have any little helpful hints on any of these stitches, make sure to shoot a comment below to help out this amazing beading community. So I'm going to continue on here doing my right angle weave stitch. And at the end of each of my right angle units, just like I did with the ladder stitch, with the herringbone, with the peyote stitch, I am going in, holding onto the thread and tightening up that last unit. So a couple more right angle units to go to get in to finish my 4th row of my example stitches, going from ladder to herringbone to peyote and now to the right angle weave. Once we're done this, we're going to go on to our brick stitch. After you're done with all 4 strands, you're going to go in and we're going to start to work on our brick stitch. So we're going to work on brick stitch, which actually starts as ladder stitch. Remember that first strand that we did? We're going to start that same method here, but just with 1 bead. So we're going to go in here and we're going to use our pink color and we're going to do a ladder stitch that is 11 beads long. So we're going to put on 2 beads. So back through that first bead, so down through that second bead. Then we're going to put on another bead. So up through and then through the one you just put on. So just like you did with the ladder stitch, except this time we're just doing it 1 single bead. This is how we're going to start our brick stitch. Again, you're going to do 11 long. So you can see I have 4 there. And then we're going to get ready to do our brick stitch after we have 11 on our starting piece. Once you have 11 on your initial ladder stitch row here, we're going to start into our brick stitch. Whenever you start brick stitch, we're going to go with our blue beads next. You're always going to pick up 2 as the start of a new row. We're going to be catching on, opposite of anything else that we've been doing, to these bridge threads, the threads that connect the beads from one to another. Because we're using 2 beads, we're going to skip over that first bridge thread and we're going to sew into or underneath that second bridge thread. Once you're sewed through that second bridge thread, I want you to sew back up through bead number 2 toward bead number 1. What that's going to do is get that second bead to sit straight up and down right on top of the other one. This brick stitch style that we're doing is going to naturally get smaller and it's going to become a triangle in shape as we add 1 less bead with each row. After you have your starter 2 beads on, you're going to do 1 single bead at a time. I'm coming out the top of bead number 2. I'm going to go to that next bridge thread, sew underneath it, and then back up through my blue bead. If that blue bead happens to pop off, it means by accident you sewed back underneath your bridge thread again as you were sewing up through the bead. Add a bead, go to that next bridge thread, sew underneath the bridge thread, and then back up through the bead. You'll notice that every other bridge thread will have 2 threads that you're sewing underneath. That's the nature of the ladder stitch below. Add a bead, sew underneath, back up through. Our starter row had 11 beads on it. This one we will finish with 10 blue beads. After we're done with those 10 blue beads, I'll show you how we're going to go and progress doing the exact same thing now as we go to a 3rd row of our seafoam beads. After you have your 10 beads on, we're ready to start with our row of 9. Again, brick stitch, starting out with 2 beads, skipping over that first bridge thread there and going into the second bridge thread. So underneath that bridge thread, and then go up through bead number 2. Once again, add a bead, go to the next bridge thread, sew underneath that bridge thread, pop that bead down, and sew back up through that bead. So we're going to continue with the pattern of going and making this into a triangle, doing our brick stitch. I'm going to do this green section, and then we're going to do 3 rows of silver. Then we're at 5 there for our green, 4 rows of blue, 3 of pink, 2 of silver, and then we're going to get ready to attach our clasp. At the end of the brick stitch, since we're at the top of the design, we're going to go ahead and include our clasp. So you'll notice that I sewed on my infinite clasp here. I have this nice turquoise and Picasso there that I'm going to use to mimic my seed beads that I'll glue in there. But I'm coming out of the top here of my brick stitch section. Also a really fun start for some fringe earrings. And I'm going to sew through coming out. So I'm at the spot where I have 2 beads left. Before I go into one, I'm going to add my clasp there. Coming out of bead number 1, getting ready like I would be to do my next row, add on my clasp, and I'm going to sew down through bead number 2, as well as the first bead there in row 2. So down through that pink one, up through the pink here, up through the silver, through my clasp, down through my silver bead. Now what I'm going to do is reinforce a 3rd time, up through the silver, through the clasp, down the other side as well. I'm going to bring my thread and needle down then the whole side of the clasp. That is going to be ready now for us to attach our ends. Now I already went ahead and attached the first set of ends. What I did for the first set of ends was I wove my thread back into the design and finish it off from the starter thread. Remember the end sides. What we did was we kept that needle and thread on because after we attached this front side, which I'll show you the attaching of the end is the exact same as the beginning. You just want to make sure that when you pull them all here, that they are lining up to the end. You can see that my peyote stitch is a little bit long. So I'll go in and I'll actually take a couple rows of my peyote stitch off. So that way it equals everything else. Once I'm set then and I make sure all my stitch sample rows are equal and at equal lengths, I'm going to go ahead and take my thread and needle for each section and finish off the thread just like I did the starter side. So for my herringbone stitch here, I'm going to sew down through 2 rows, circle my thread back up to the last 2 rows, which is the same thing that I did again on the other side. So we're just finishing off our stitches. And then once you have it back a couple rows and you've done this a couple times, you're going to go in here and catch onto a bridge thread, just like that brick stitch, a thread that connects one bead to the other. So underneath there, make a little loop, sew through the loop once, sew through the loop twice, doing a nice little sewer's knot. Pull that down towards the project, give a nice tight pull, take your thread and needle elsewhere in the project, getting rid of that, and then burn that thread edge down. One down. I'm going to do the ladder stitch in the same way, and I'm going to do the right angle weave in the same way, just going back and doing a bridge thread. Right now, the peyote stitch side, I'm going to keep that thread on, and I'll show you why, because we're going to end up closing it off and making it flat there since it ends uneven with our 11 seed beads. So go ahead right now and finish up your ladder stitch, your herringbone stitch, and your right angle weave, and then we'll get ready to attach our fun end to the opposite side to finish off our stitch sample bracelet. So when it comes to finishing off the peyote stitch row, you can see I've already finished off the others. I want you to grab one 11 seed bead and sew into the next row like you've been progressing, and then grab another 11 seed bead. Of course, I had one out. And use that to fill in the gap. What that's going to do is allow you to have pretty much a straight surface here. After doing so, just like the rest of the strands, we're sewing back into the peyote stitch, and we are going to exit, do that sewer's knot, grabbing underneath a bridge thread, 1, 2 times through the loop that you create, do that nice tight knot, take that a couple other places. See how I'm doing the knot in the center of the project rather than on the side, so you don't see that knot. Same thing here, do another knot. And this is how you're going to do standard to get rid of your thread in peyote stitch anyway. You're going to kind of sew back through. Some people will not even knot the thread. They'll just sew far enough back through that the thread gets tangled and you don't have to worry about it. After my second knot here, I'm going to take my thread and needle, bring it down into the project, figure out a nice place. If you have green thread next to a green bead, white thread next to a white bead, that's always the best place to burn off your thread. and burr that thread edge down. Now I have all my ends ready. So I did this again on the other side before I went in and added my clasp. To add the clasp here, we're going to be attaching it to the ends of this brick stitch. Coming out the end here, I want to make sure that it is sitting so that my infinite clasp is facing up. And when I look at it, my loop on the other, my tongue here on the other side is facing the same direction. So my thread and needle are coming out the ladder stitch first, nice and easy. We're going to go through the ladder stitch. Your thread's coming out right there, through those 2 ladder stitch beads. Skip over 1, 2 beads, and sew down through the 3rd bead in your series. Go back into then the row behind, up a couple beads, give a nice tight pull, go down those beads, and repeat. If you want to, you can put an 11-0 on each side. That's kind of up to you. Go back through that one more time, down through, and then we're going to come up and out bead number 4. So you're kind of going right along that ladder stitch. When you come out through bead number 4, it is time to combine it with your herringbone stitch. Easy here, go up through 2 beads, because these beads line up perfectly. Go down through the 2 beads on the opposite side, and then go back to your ladder stitch and down through the next bead. So think about when you're sewing strands together like this, it's basically just like sewing on a button. You want to sew back through a couple times, making sure that it's all stitching, and you don't want to see the thread unless it's the thread that you intend to show. So you see I went in there and sewed between those first 2 rows. Now once again, I'm going to skip over to my next open bead there. Let that lay down. You can see here I let 1 bead stay open before going in and doing my herringbone stitch. So that bead there I'm going to let open, or sorry, my peyote stitch. I'm going to go through the next bead here. And I have 2 beads that or 3 beads that encompass that stitch. So I'm going to go back up through here, kind of circle around because I want to come out through that pink bead there. So how do you get there? Just look and see how you can follow your thread line to achieve your thread coming out exactly where you want it. So there I backed it out. Go in here then to your piece, sew through your last entire row of your peyote stitch, which is that 11 O's and 2 of your 8 seed beads. Same deal here, let it lay up next to the stitch, and you're going to be going over 3 beads, 1, 2, 3, we're coming out of that 1 bead, and we're going to go down through bead number 3, and see how that gets that to lay. Circle your thread and needle kind of back around the stitch here. Come out that same spot. And once again, sew on to your peyote stitch. Then when you get to your right angle, super easy. You're just going right to your starter bead there, where those 2 beads line up, coming out bead number 2, going through your right angle. I suggest taking a trip around the right angle through that blue bead and then back through bead number 1, tying off the thread, and that connects that end there. After doing so and connecting the end on the previous side, you're just going to tie your thread end off, weaving it back into the project, and finish off your piece. You'll have that starter thread that you can tie onto, finish that up, and in my case here, I have that infinite clasp. I am going to glue that on. I always like to show, if I can, how this bracelet is going to look and lay on your wrist. So it almost looks like one complete, or 4 separate bracelets. It's going to look like one complete unit when you put it on. Whether or not you do it in 3 colors with different beads, you do it in 4 colors, 2 colors. I have one I keep looking for that's just in pearl and gold, and that is a beautiful setting as well. So once I have that clasp in there and it's all completed, my stitch sample bracelet is ready to go. This is a great one to write down, to look at as you're making it. And not only do sometimes you have the stitch samples in like a book, but this time you get to wear it. So it's even more fun learning all of these different stitches in one complete bracelet, tying them together. Thanks so much for watching that flat stitch sample bracelet. Remember, there's lots of modifications that you can make in sizes and shapes of beads, but it's nice to do it with those basic materials to get that nice simplistic look. Going into that brick stitch in a nice V shape without adding a lot of details. Remember, if you do need any materials, go ahead and look below the video in the description to shop with us online. You can also hit up the comment section and help out other beaders in this community learn some amazing skills, pointing them to different techniques or tips that you may have learned along the way. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next inspirational video.